Ethiopia. That debate starts right now with Coletta Wanjohi as well as Sherwin Bryce Peace and Sophie Mokoena. We'll leave you to that. A good night from me.
Thanks very much, Griselda. Now, tonight, as she said, we're looking at the conflict in Ethiopia. A bit of background. In early November, Ethiopia's Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, ordered military action against the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, which is a rebel group in the Tigray region in the north that followed an attack on a military base. Already, tens of thousands of people have fled to Sudan, and the conflict risks destabilizing the region. 2 days ago, the government declared victory after troops were sent in, but the defiant leader of the TPLF has told Associated Press today that the fighting continues on every front. Well, to discuss tonight, we're joined by our foreign editor at the SABC, Sophie Mokoena, our Ethiopian correspondent, Coletta Wanjohi, and our US correspondent, Sherwin Bryce Peace. Welcome to you all. Coletta, let me start with you. Just tell us what it's like to be in Ethiopia right now. I'm sure it's hard to access the regions where some of the hardest fighting is happening. And the TPLF to the world seems to have come out of nowhere, but of course it never happens like that. There's a history. Just give us a bit of the background here.
Well, with the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front was one of the four parties that formed a coalition that ruled Ethiopia for 27 years before 2018 when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed took over power. And during that time, they enjoyed, a lot of power, political power, military power, and economic power. So once the power changed hands to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed dissolved that coalition and said that there should be a coalition of 9 parties, each of them representing the 9 regions of the country, called it Prosperity Party. But the TPLF from the north said they would not join that party. And since then, we've seen a push and pull between the Prime Minister's party, the Prime Minister himself, and the leadership in the north. And he has today, while in Parliament, he tried to explain and said that the TPLF have been part of and parcel of the causes of more than 100 different conflicts in different parts of the country. But I think what really the tip of the iceberg was around September, when the country was supposed to go into polls, but the National Electoral Board said that they wouldn't do that because of COVID-19 pandemic. But the TPLF in the northern region went ahead and did its own regional elections and said that from September they would not recognize Abiy Ahmed as a legitimate leader. That became an issue. And then we had the Prime Minister coming up on 4th and saying that the regional forces in the north that are loyal to the Tigray People's Liberation Front had attempted to break into the national barracks in the north. And that's why we're seeing now this war here. The government says, or the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed says, the TPLF have gone against constitutional order and they need to be brought back to law and order.
Yeah. And Coletta, is it hard to report on this? Is it very difficult for reporters to get into those northern regions at the moment?
Exactly. It has been quite challenging from 4th November because, to begin with, even as journalists, we could not access the region. The military now says it has completed the fighting or the confrontation, but still, we still cannot go into, for example, the Tigray region, the heart of it, which is the Mekelle city. So because of that, we've seen a lot of problems in terms of accessing information. We do not know whatever we're being told. We cannot verify, So we've got the government saying something, we've got the TPLF saying something, we've got the humanitarian agencies saying something, but it's really hard for us to verify because no one has really gone into the heart of where the fighting is happening.
Yeah. All right, let's look at some of the responses. Perhaps, Sophie, we can start with you, the African Union. And of course, this is on the plate of our own President, Cyril Ramaphosa, as head of the AU.
Yes, of course, President Ramaphosa did appoint envoys to go to Ethiopia to have a discussion with the Prime Minister. We know that former South African President Kgalema Motlanthe is part of that envoy. That would include the former Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the only woman in that group, but also the former President of Mozambique, President Joaquim Chissano. And they did meet with the Prime Minister, who was able, as we are told by the AU leaders, that they did have a discussion where the Prime Minister was able to explain the background to the whole conflict, and also the AU saying that having heard from the Prime Minister, they understand that Prime Minister indicated to them that the conflict will soon soon end. But when you look at the international community, they are still fighting diplomatically, saying that more pressure must be on Ethiopia, the Prime Minister, to ask him to retreat. But him saying that people must remember that Ethiopia is not a newcomer to diplomacy. You know very well in the history of the continent, Ethiopia was never conquered by the colonizers, and therefore the fight between the colonizers and people who have vested interest on the continent has been there for quite a long time. And him saying that they cannot be dictated to in terms of how they should manage the affairs of Ethiopia, but also lashing out at the rebels in that country. Let's take a listen at what he had to say earlier on when he was speaking in Parliament about this matter. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed.
So arrogance, pride is bad. It brings about destruction, and it has a blinding force. If we have this power and this armaments, that's the way that's the reason that led them to act like this. Before this, they have openly said, if you don't do what we tell you to do, would create havoc not only in Ethiopia, in East Africa. This is not in they don't say this in secret. They speak this to diplomats, and the diplomats get afraid. They said if you touch them, they would disrupt the peace of the area. What is very sad about this is an old ape wants to jump like a young one, and it gets into trouble. These people have no knowledge of military science at all whatsoever. They just have old mentality, be it economic or military.
Well, as you are aware, and we know that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has received intelligence military training here in South Africa, and therefore him speaking as a young person, as a young leader, that the old guard in that region don't understand where he wants to take the country to, because he wants a united Ethiopia. He doesn't want a divided Ethiopia that is based on regionalism but also on tribalism. And him saying that it's time that the old leadership understand that the young leaders and the young people on the continent have a different view in terms of what needs to happen on the continent.
And Coletta, I want to speak to you in a short while about the ethnic undertones here to this conflict. But first, Sherwin, the United Nations watching this closely. Just tell us how they've responded since the start of this conflict.
I'll start with the Secretary of State in Washington, if you'll let me, Francis. Mike Pompeo, a short time ago, essentially the chief diplomat of the United States, tweeting that he spoke with Ethiopia's Prime Minister, urged him to complete the end of the fighting in Tigray. He called for a start to dialogue and free, safe, unhindered humanitarian access. You know, the big part we don't talk about, as much as there are ethnic tensions in Ethiopia, the big part of this conflict is the humanitarian impact that it's wrought on the population in northern Ethiopia, and the influx of people and refugees you're seeing into southern Sudan. Some 45,000 so far, according to the United Nations. The Secretary General's spokesperson, Stefan Dujarric, currently briefing reporters here at the United Nations. Francis, he is saying things like the Secretary General spoke by telephone with one of those envoys, Liberia's former President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who updated the Secretary General on the envoy's efforts under the auspices of the African Union chairperson. The Secretary General expressed his grave concern over the consequences of the Ethiopian conflict to the civilian population and over the spread of hate speech and reports of ethnic profiling. The Secretary General expressed the UN's full support for the African Union initiative led by President Ramaphosa. Of course, as I mentioned, the humanitarian aspect here, the big issue, the UN has now been calling for humanitarian corridors, essentially access to the vulnerable populations. They talk about the fact that before the fighting actually started around the capital Mekelle in the Tigray region, that a lot of people in that region were already suffering from fuel, cash and basic commodity shortages. We also heard earlier from the High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, in terms of that humanitarian access, Francis. This is how he put it.
I'm also very worried about the situation inside Ethiopia on two accounts in particular. One, which I share with other humanitarian organizations. We still have no access to all the people that we used to assist before and to people freshly displaced by the fighting. And I want to renew here the appeal that we humanitarians have made to the federal authorities of Ethiopia to grant us that access, because people are in need and we need to collect information and to provide assistance to them. My UN colleagues in Addis are discussing with the Ethiopian government, and we hope that these promises of humanitarian corridor, I call it access more than corridor, because it will be in different places, will be granted as soon as possible.
Well, Francis, the UN, of course, also calling for around $147 million to deal with the internally displaced, deal with people that are crossing borders. And one such person is a 65-year-old Ethiopian refugee by the name of Berhan Hali. He managed to cross the border by foot with a walking stick, crossing the border into Sudan. This is what he had to say.
The reason I escaped is because of the war, but the main thing is that when I decided to come here, they were shooting heavy fire all over the village. That's why I decided to escape. Because of Abiy Ahmed, we weren't allowed to live in peace in our village, because he sent troops all over. As you can see, I'm not able to walk properly. I depend on my stick. I came and walked to Sudan, which was my only option. I wasn't the only one walking. So many people were walking alongside me, mothers carrying their children on their backs, and others the same age as me, little children walking, all because of Abiy Ahmed.
So obviously there are political dynamics at play here. There is an economic struggle at play in that region, but also the humanitarian consequences of this issue. I can tell you also, Francis, that the UN Security Council has met on this situation. They met once last week. Initially, this was a proposal by the African nations in the council, what you call the A3+1, the three African countries plus St. Vincent and the Grenadines. They proposed to brief the Security Council on the efforts of those three envoys, but then withdrew that proposal because they wanted to give time for regional efforts to really take shape here, and that was superseded by the European members of the Council who went ahead with that meeting, and they too are of course calling now for humanitarian access, which appears to be the big focus from the UN perspective, Francis.
And we'll talk about those regional efforts with Sophie, but first, Coletta, it was so interesting that that man, that insert that Sherwin played, was blaming Abiy Ahmed, the Prime Minister, for what is going on in the region, suggesting maybe he supports the rebels. This is about a fight for self-determination. I understand that there are 6 million people or so in this region. Do we know how many of them, what percentage or what sort of support this rebel grouping has amongst those people?
Well, I think with the war, there's usually several sides. So what we're having now, for example, from the interview that you've played, is a citizen who feels that he has been unfairly targeted by what is supposed to be a war above him. And that's what we've seen also the Ethiopia Human Rights Commission bringing out and saying that the ugly head of ethnicity has come out with this conflict. It has given several insights saying that it has received reports of people being ethnically profiled just because they're Tigrays. People have lost their jobs, it says. People are being removed from aeroplanes and all that. It has removed and given an appeal to the government now that it says the war is over, that it should appeal to the airport authorities especially to ensure that they do not force people to get off the plane just because they are from a certain ethnicity, which is the Tigray now, and they're going for other issues. So ethnicity has become an issue now, and the sad bit about it is, given the context of the issue, the Prime Minister has a valid reason to say that he needs to bring the country back to law and order, because he needs to do that in order to be seen to be in power and to really be in power. But on the other side, the TPLF wants to maintain their power for their own reasons, but the problem is it's the civilians who've been suffering, and then you cannot control how people think, you cannot control the words that people throw at each other, you cannot control the attitude that other citizens are having against other people just because they are from that ethnic group. So that has become an issue. The government trying to say that it's not fighting the Tigray people, but it's fighting just a clique of what it calls criminals, but still maintaining that and controlling people's attitudes is really a problem. So ethnicity is really a big issue, and government really has to do much about it after, the military offensive is over.
Especially because Abiy Ahmed said he wanted to unite Ethiopians. That is what he's sticking to, sort of not letting ethnicity tear the country apart. So, Sophie, take us through the regional issues here, because Eritrea is involved, the rebels sending rockets into Eritrea, and of course thousands, hundreds of thousands, or at least tens of thousands fleeing into Sudan.
Well, of course, the whole Horn of Africa will definitely be affected. You know that countries there, they live side by side. And therefore, at this moment, they will definitely be affected. But earlier on, Prime Minister Abiy indicating that the Ethiopian government, or Ethiopia in general, is not a stranger to people fleeing their own countries to Ethiopia during conflict. You know that during the conflict in Sudan, in South Sudan, and the neighboring countries, people always cross to Ethiopia as well. And Ethiopia has been able to host many refugees in its own country. You had the World Food Program official talking about how they want to access people. Besides this latest standoff and victims of this latest standoff, there are people in Ethiopia who are receiving assistance from the World Food Program in terms of them fleeing their own respective countries. And therefore, he was saying they'll be able to manage this situation. But I think the whole Horn of Africa must work together to look at this matter. And of course, the African Union, as the continental body, must definitely assist Ethiopia to find a solution, and a lasting solution to this problem. But you know that Prime Minister Abiy does believe in South Africa in particular. He visited the country where he expressed his support and understanding and friendship with South Africa, because it dates back to exile years with Haile Selassie, Oliver Tambo, and Nelson Mandela, and some of the cadres of the ANC receiving military training in Ethiopia. And therefore, I think President Ramaphosa, as the chair of the African Union, is in a position, if he can utilize that, to try and speak to the authorities in Ethiopia to ensure that the ceasefire, and the ceasefire does hold. But unfortunately, with rebels, you can't predict. They are fighting for their own territory. They want power. And therefore, people fighting for power don't just give in.
Yeah. All right. And of course, we'll follow and see how the AU's involvement is received, South Africa's opinions as well. Sherwin, you spoke to somebody looking at what we've been talking about, the ethnic roots here, the other roots to this conflict. Just tell us more what he had to say.
I was just going to add on to what Sophie was saying in terms of President Ramaphosa's role here as African Union chairperson. Let's also not forget that he's very involved, playing a central role in trying to resolve the dispute as it relates to the great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam dispute between Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt. So let's spare a thought for South Africa's presidents. Lots of fires burning, lots of stakes in different fires. Certainly, the Brookings Institution, which is a major policy think tank in Washington, D.C., held a discussion about the underlying conditions here in terms of the manifestation, in terms of the conflict we are seeing between the Tigray Authority and the Ethiopian central government. And they explained as part of that discussion, Francis, that Ethiopia is a federal country, right? You have federal regions that have a great deal of autonomy. And so this very much is about the federal regions in Ethiopia trying to stake their power in terms of their new relationship with the central government. Just for people who didn't know, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front is essentially a makeup of 4 regional parties in Ethiopia that governed Ethiopia for much of the 21st century. And in 2019, a new party was formed called Prosperity Party, in which the four parties, the Amhara Democratic Party, the Oromo Democratic Party, and the Southern Ethiopian People's Democratic Movement moved along and formed that new party called Prosperity Party. The outlier was the Tigray People's Liberation Front, and they are now central to the conflict that you're seeing now with the central government. Let's listen to what Zach Verton had to say in terms of the background to this conflict. He's a foreign policy fellow at the Brookings Institution. Watch.
This conflict, in my opinion, is about power. It's about economics, and it's about competing visions for the Ethiopian state. It's about balancing stability and democratization, ethnic loyalties and national identity, and it's about a tension between the old status quo and a desire for change. When Prime Minister Abiy came to power in 2018, I noted at the time that he had finally taken the lid off of Ethiopia. And I think that lid needed to come off because the old system could no longer contain popular demands for change. So removing that lid meant initiating one of the world's most important political transitions, but it's also its most fragile. And I think what we're watching now is that project come dangerously close to disaster, and the potential consequences of a wider war or of chaos in Ethiopia really should not be underestimated.
So in summary, what he's saying there, Francis, is that the changes we have seen in Ethiopia over the last number of years under the leadership of Abiy Ahmed are meeting their own headwinds, and this is now manifesting itself in the northern parts of that country. This is about economy, this is about power, and this is about who's going to win the day in a country of 115 million people with various ethnic modalities that come to play in situations like this, Francis.
Yeah. Well, Coletta, then over to you. I mean, the change that the northern group wants is succession. They want self-determination. What are the chances of that?
Well, maybe that would have been something that would have come on the table before 4th November. But now the fact that the Tigray People's Liberation Front has been declared as a terrorist group, the Attorney General said amongst the crimes that they will be charged with, members of that group, is terrorism, attack on the Constitution and all that. So they are more of being looked at criminals now. So the aspect of secession and all that, talking about it, cannot be on the table now because they are not they're not considered as people who would sit with the other people as law-abiding citizens. So it was there, the aspect of secession, but now with the fighting and all this, now the government says the next step is looking for a list of people that it has outlined, searching for them, arresting them, and bringing them to book. Yeah. So if these are the leaders who would be talking about secession, then that topic of secession has to be put on hold for now. And we also know that the northern region has to be rehabilitated again, because after the war, then people have to rebuild the area in some way.
Well, finally, Coletta, you're saying they're being seen as criminals, but as in any situation like this, there are claims from both sides. There are claims that Ahmed and the army have targeted and killed civilians. Any truth to that?
Well, like I said, getting information from India is really a challenge. So we have what the government is saying, and we have what the TPLF says from time to time when they deem it fit to speak. So according to what the Prime Minister said today in Parliament, he said that the military, the federal forces, the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, has not killed any civilians. So that was kind of pushing the blame on the TPLF, saying that if there are any civilians, maybe who would have succumbed to the war, it might have been from the other side, because we've seen the government blaming the TPLF as using civilians as human shields, you know. So, but if we go by what the International Committee of Red Cross has said, they have said one hospital, particularly in the area, has run out of medicine, has run out of medication. They are receiving people who have issues with, they have trauma, and they are also saying they have run out of body bags. So that kind of denotes the number of the dead is a bit high. But where we stand right now, verifying information is really an issue. Yeah. But of course, in any war, casualties must be there. We just don't know how many, because the government has said the number is not an issue. But yeah, casualties are there. Yeah. That at least that we're sure.
And such sad information from Médecins Sans Frontières today, saying that people are crossing the border into Sudan with nothing, just the shirt on their back. They don't even have time to collect their belongings. All right, we have to leave it there. A very volatile region. Thank you for the explanation, and we'll follow developments in Ethiopia. That was Foreign Editor Sophie Mokoena, Ethiopian correspondent Coletta Wanjohi, and SABC's US correspondent Sherwin Bryce Peace. And that